They said I was invisible. They were right until I wasn't. My name is Rachel. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 3 years of my father's life, I gave up everything to make sure he didn't spend a single night alone. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. I didn't do it expecting a reward. I didn't do it to earn anything. I did it because he was my father, and because when I walked into his hospital room the day he was diagnosed, I looked at his hands. Those big, steady hands that used to fix my bicycle and sign my permission slips and wave from the driveway every single morning, and I knew I couldn't leave. My sister Megan didn't have the same problem. Megan is 5 years older than me. She lives in Seattle in a house she bought with the kind of money that makes people stop asking follow-up questions. She has a husband named Philip who wears linen shirts and talks about wine, and 2 kids who call our father, Grandpa Harold, twice a year on FaceTime. She built her life far away from our small Ohio hometown, and she was very proud of that distance. She talked about it like it was an accomplishment. When Dad was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer in the spring of my 29th year, I had a life too. I had an apartment in Columbus, a job I actually liked at a physical therapy clinic, and a relationship that was maybe turning into something real. I had plans. I had momentum. I gave all of it up in about 2 weeks. The apartment went first, then the job. I gave notice, packed my equipment certifications into a folder, and told my supervisor I didn't know when I'd be back. Daniel, the man I'd been seeing for 8 months, said he understood. He said it 3 more times over the following 6 months, before he stopped calling. I understood that too. I moved back into my childhood bedroom with the faded yellow curtains and the shelf of old paperbacks and the window that looked out over my father's vegetable garden. I learned how to administer his medications on schedule. I learned the names of his oncologists, his insurance codes, the specific brand of protein shake that didn't make him nauseated. I drove him to chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday, and sat in the waiting room with a book I never actually read, just to be there when he came out. Megan flew in for the first round of chemo. She stayed 4 days, cried twice, told everyone at the treatment center that she was coordinating the family response, and flew back to Seattle. She called every Sunday after that. Sometimes. I want to be fair. I know that people grieve differently. I know that watching a parent get sick is terrifying, and that some people run toward it, and some people run away, and neither one makes you a monster. I know all of that. But there were moments. There were specific moments that I still think about at 2 in the morning, when I can't sleep. The Thanksgiving when Megan flew in with Philip and the kids and spent the whole dinner talking about a real estate investment she was considering, while I sat next to our father and quietly cut his food into smaller pieces because his hands were shaking that week from the new medication. She didn't notice, or she noticed and decided it wasn't her job. The morning I called her in tears because Dad had a bad night, really bad. The kind where you sit on the floor outside the bathroom and hold his hand under the door because he won't let you in. But he doesn't want to be alone. And she listened for 4 minutes and then said she had a work call and she'd check in later. She didn't call back until Thursday, the Christmas where she sent a gift basket and a card signed with a printed font. And Dad propped the card on his nightstand and looked at it sometimes and didn't say anything, and I had to leave the room. And then there was what I started calling the desk situation. Dad had run a small but successful manufacturing business for 30 years. Nothing glamorous, custom metal components for industrial equipment, the kind of thing nobody thinks about until something breaks. He'd built it from a 2-man shop in 1991, to a company with 43 employees and contracts with 3 major distributors. It was called Hartwell Precision, after our mother's maiden name. She had died when I was 11, and he had kept her name on the door of every building he'd ever owned since then. Megan had worked in the business for about 4 years in her late 20s, before she moved to Seattle. She knew the operations. She knew the key people. She understood the structure in a way I didn't. I had gone into healthcare, not manufacturing. When Dad got sick, Megan made it clear, in that quiet, matter-of-fact way of hers, that she expected to be the one who would eventually handle the business side of things. Dad never explicitly disagreed with her. He also never explicitly agreed. He would nod when she talked about it, and then he would change the subject. I noticed that. I filed it away without knowing why. In his final year, when the cancer progressed and his good days became fewer and further between, Dad spent a lot of time in his home office. Not working exactly. He had a trusted operations manager named Frank who was running the day-to-day by then, but he sat at his desk for hours, going through files, writing things down in the leather notebooks he'd kept for 30 years. Sometimes I'd bring him coffee, and he'd look up with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not sad, exactly. More like someone finishing a very long letter. I didn't ask what he was doing. It felt private. It felt like something that was his. Once, maybe 8 months before the end, I brought him his afternoon medication and he looked up from the desk and said, "Rachel, you know where everything is, don't you?" I told him I knew where his medication was, his insurance documents, his medical records. He smiled. He said, "That's not exactly what I meant." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "When the time comes, go to Frank first, before anyone else. Will you remember that?" I said I would remember. He nodded and went back to his notebook, and I stood there for a moment with his coffee cup in my hand, and this strange pressure in my chest that I didn't know what to do with, so I just set the cup down and went back to the kitchen. That was a Thursday in October. He passed on a Tuesday in June, 14 months later. It was early morning, the light coming through the yellow curtains the way it always did. And it was quiet, and I was there. I called Megan first. She flew in the next day. To her credit, she was genuinely devastated. Whatever else I can say about my sister, she loved our father. She cried through the entire first evening, and I held her on the couch, and we looked through old photos, and I made her tea. And for one night it felt like we were just two sisters who had lost their dad. That lasted about 36 hours. On the third day, Megan came downstairs in the morning while I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands around a mug, and she set a yellow legal pad in front of me. She had been making lists. The house needed to go on the market, she said. The estate would need to be liquidated to settle everything cleanly. She had already called a realtor she knew, a friend of Philip's cousin, very experienced with estate sales. And the business, well, the business was the complicated part. But she had already been in touch with Frank, and she thought the cleanest solution was probably to find a buyer within the next 12 months, before the value started to drift. I looked at the yellow legal pad. It was very organized. It had columns. I asked her if she had talked to Dad's attorney. She said the attorney would obviously be involved in the formal process, but that the overall direction was fairly clear. She would manage the estate, as the older daughter and the one with relevant business background, and we would both receive our portions once everything was settled. I asked her what "our portions" meant. She paused, then she said, in this very careful voice, that of course I would receive something. A portion of the house value, after fees, maybe some personal items. But that the bulk of the estate, and certainly the business decisions, would need to be handled by someone who understood these things. She said it gently. She said it like she was doing me a favor. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her if she had read Dad's will. She said of course she had. She was talking about what the will outlined. Something about the way she said it made me look at her more carefully. And I thought about that Thursday afternoon in October. And what Dad had said about going to Frank first. I told Megan I needed some time. I told her I was exhausted and that I needed a few days before I could talk about any of this. She was impatient, I could see it. But she nodded and said she understood and went upstairs to make phone calls. That evening, after she went to bed, I went to Dad's office. I sat in his chair. I looked at his desk. I opened the center drawer and I found, taped to the inside bottom with a small piece of painter's tape, a business card. The card said, Thomas Greeley, Estate and Business Law. There was a handwritten note on the back in my father's handwriting. It said, Rachel, call Tom. He's been waiting. I held the card in my hands for a long time. Then I went to bed, and I lay in the dark with the card on my nightstand. And I thought about what Megan had said. About portions. About someone who understood these things. I called Thomas Greeley at 8 o'clock the next morning. His assistant put me through immediately, like she had been expecting the call. Tom Greeley himself answered on the second ring, and when I told him my name, he said, "Rachel, your father told me you'd be the one to call. I'm very glad you did." He asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. I said yes. I didn't tell Megan where I was going. Tom Greeley's office was in a brick building downtown, third floor, the kind of place with wood paneling and the smell of old paper, and the quiet that serious things happen in. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with a handshake that was firm and steady. He reminded me a little of my father. He sat me down and he slid a document across the desk toward me. He said, "Your father updated his estate plan 18 months ago. He was very deliberate about it, and very specific. Before we go through the details, I want to ask you something." I waited. He said, "Did your sister tell you she had already reviewed the will?" I said she had implied it, that she seemed confident about what it said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Rachel, has your sister actually contacted this office at any point since her father's passing?" I said I didn't know. I assumed she had. He folded his hands on the desk. He said, "She has not. I've had no contact from Megan whatsoever, which means that anything she's told you about the contents of this estate is based either on a very old document or on an assumption." He paused. "I want you to read this." I read it. I read it twice. My father had left the house to be divided, 60% to me, 40% to Megan, in recognition of, and his exact words still live in my chest, "the sacrifices Rachel made in her presence during my illness, for which I am more grateful than I can express in any document." He had left Megan a specific cash inheritance. Generous. Genuinely generous. The kind of number that would mean real security. He had also established a structured disbursement for her portion of any remaining liquid assets, with a trustee overseeing the schedule. And then there was Hartwell Precision. Dad had established a separate trust for the business 22 months before he died. Before the will revision. Before even the worst of his illness. He had placed operational control and primary ownership, 58%, into that trust. The beneficiary of that trust was me. He had left a letter with the document. I won't share all of it. But one part I will tell you, because it's the part I come back to when things are hard. He wrote, "Rachel, I watched you choose presents over everything else, and I want you to know that I saw every single morning. You have your mother's steadiness. Hartwell was built on that. It belongs with you." I sat in Tom Greeley's office and I cried for a while, and he was kind enough to push a box of tissues across the desk and pretend to be very interested in his own notes until I was done. Then I drove home. Megan was in the kitchen when I got back. She looked up when I walked in, and something in my face must have shifted, because she set down her phone and said, "What?" I told her I had met with Dad's attorney. The color in her face changed. Not all at once. It was more like watching something drain slowly. She said, "What did he say?" I told her she should probably call Tom's office and arrange her own meeting, that there were things she needed to hear directly from him. She stared at me. Then she said, in a voice that was trying to stay controlled, "Rachel, what's in the will?" I thought about the yellow legal pad with its columns. I thought about someone who understands these things. I thought about the Thursday in October, and my father's hands in his notebook, and the way he'd said that's not exactly what I meant. I said, "Dad left a letter for you too. Tom has it." I didn't say anything else. She called Tom's office that afternoon. I don't know exactly what was said. I was in the backyard, sitting in Dad's garden, which was overgrown now, but still had the shape he'd given it, the careful rows he'd pressed into the earth with his own hands. The tomato cages were still standing. I sat there for a long time. Megan came outside about an hour later. She sat in the other chair, the one that had always been our mother's chair, and neither of us spoke for a while. Finally she said, "I didn't know." I said I believed her. She said, "The business, Rachel. You don't know anything about manufacturing. I told her she was right, I didn't, and that I had no intention of pretending otherwise. I told her I had already called Frank, the operations manager, that afternoon. Dad had told me to go to Frank first, and I finally understood why. Frank had been with Hartwell for 19 years. He knew every contract, every employee, every client relationship. He knew what my father had built and how it ran. Frank, it turned out, had also known about the trust for over a year. Dad had told him. He said he'd been waiting for my call. I told Megan that I intended to keep the business running, with Frank's leadership, and that I hoped over time we could figure out a way to work together if she wanted to be involved. That I wasn't shutting her out, but that decisions would need to go through me. She looked at the garden. She said, "He always trusted you more." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I don't think that's what it was. I think he trusted that I would be here." That was the difference, not love. He loved us both. But presence, consistency, the willingness to stay. The weeks after that were not easy. Megan hired her own attorney, and there was a period of back and forth that was exhausting and painful and made me feel like I was losing my father a second time. But the documents were clear. Dad had been meticulous. Tom Greeley was steady and kind and thorough, and in the end, there was nothing to contest. Megan flew back to Seattle in August. Before she left, she came to find me in Dad's office, my office now, though I still have trouble saying that. She stood in the doorway, and she looked at the desk and the shelves of notebooks and the small photo of our mother that Dad had kept on the corner of the desk for as long as I could remember. She said, "I'm sorry for what I said about the portions." I told her I accepted that. She looked like she wanted to say more. Then she just nodded and left. I sat at the desk after she was gone. I opened the center drawer, the empty one now, where the business card had been, and I put my hand flat against the bottom of it, the place where the tape had left a small ghost of residue. I thought about all the mornings I had gotten up before the sun to make sure his medications were ready, all the nights I had slept with my phone on loud in case he needed me, all the Tuesday and Thursday waiting rooms, all the things I had quietly set down in order to stay. I didn't do any of it for this. I want to be honest about that. I didn't stay because I expected a reward. I stayed because he was my father and he needed someone to stay. But here is what I have come to understand. Sitting at his desk in the mornings with coffee and the light coming through the window over the garden, the people who show up, really show up. Not for the good parts, but for the hard parts. Not when it's convenient, but when it costs something. Those people are seen. Even when they think no one is watching. Even when they're running on 4 hours of sleep and they've forgotten what their old life felt like. Even then. My father saw me. Hartwell Precision has 43 employees. I am learning, slowly, what it means to be responsible for all of them. Frank is patient and Frank is brilliant, and once a week we sit in the conference room and he explains something to me, and I take notes and ask questions, and he never once makes me feel like I don't belong there. The tomatoes came back in the garden. I don't know if I planted them right, but they came back. I like to think my father would find that funny and also not at all surprising. I am 32 years old. I live in the house where I grew up, and for the first time in a long time, when I wake up in the morning and look at those yellow curtains, I don't feel like I gave my life away. I feel like I found out what it was made of. If you're the quiet one in your family, the one who stays, the one who does the hard thing without being asked, the one who keeps showing up when it would be so much easier to stop. I want you to hear this. You are not invisible. You are not small. You are not less. Sometimes the ones who see you most clearly are the ones who've been watching all along, from the chair by the window, with steady hands and a leather notebook and a business card taped to the inside of a drawer. Stay gentle. Hold your ground, and when someone hands you a business card with your name on the back, call. I've thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did, not just in the days after my father passed, but across all those years that led up to it. And the more I sit with it, the clearer one thing becomes: the way a story ends is almost never a surprise. It's just the final shape of every choice that came before it. Megan made her choices. She chose distance when closeness was hard. She chose comfort when sacrifice was what the moment asked for. I don't say that with bitterness. I genuinely believe she told herself it was fine, that someone else had it covered, that she would show up when it really mattered. Most people who drift away from hard things believe exactly that, but choices have weight, and weight accumulates, and eventually you are standing in a kitchen with a yellow legal pad full of columns, assuming a story belongs to you that was never yours to claim. I made my choices too. I chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. I chose to learn the medication schedules and the insurance codes and the names of every nurse on the Tuesday rotation. I chose to answer the phone at 2 in the morning and to sit in waiting rooms with books I never read and to keep showing up even when I was so tired I couldn't remember what rested felt like. I didn't make those choices because I was calculating a return. I made them because they were right and because my father needed someone who understood that being present is not a favor. It's a form of love that asks nothing back. What my father understood, I think, is something that takes most people a lifetime to learn. That character is not what you say about yourself in the good moments. It is what you do in the invisible ones. Rachel didn't give 3 years of her life because cameras were rolling. She did it in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the Tuesday afternoons that nobody would ever write a story about. And that consistency, that steady, unglamorous faithfulness, was exactly what he trusted to carry something forward. There is a kind of wisdom that cannot be faked or rushed. It comes from doing hard things honestly, over and over, until your character is no longer something you have to think about. It simply is you. My father had that. He built an entire company on it. 43 people, 30 years, his late wife's name on the door. He knew how to recognize it in someone else, because he had spent a lifetime building it in himself. And there is a kind of resilience that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like patience. It looks like getting up one more morning and making one more cup of coffee and doing what needs to be done without anyone handing you a medal for it. Rachel had that. I had that. The people who watched from a distance and assumed we were small were reading the wrong story. If you are in the middle of a long, quiet season of doing the right thing and wondering if it matters, it matters. Not because someone will necessarily reward you for it, and not because the world keeps score in any reliable way. It matters because of what it makes you. Every time you choose presence over convenience, honesty over ease, steadiness over self-protection, you are building something. Slowly, invisibly, the way a good foundation is built. My father saw it. He always saw it. And when the time came, he made sure I knew.